Hi, everyone. My name is Jason.
My name is Benteen.
And welcome to the Elevated Convo podcast. On this podcast, we answer sort of contemporary modern day questions with spiritual concepts. We go through different religious traditions, pull from all sorts of different spiritual guidance, religious texts. And the reason we do that is because we think there's a lot of wisdom in these old writings. And we like the idea of taking these older writings and applying them to modern everyday problems. And today we have a question from a listener. His name is Jamshed, and he wrote in and he's sort of asking about masculinity. He wants to think about, what does it mean to be a man in the modern day? He's talked about how, there's these different characters online, the Andrew Tates, whoever, that are, pushing this sort of maybe questionable ideology, and he just wants practical advice. So we're going to talk about all that today. Why don't we start by reading the question?
Let's do it. This question is from Jamshed. Hey, one thing I've been reflecting on is how to think about being a man in the modern age. I think that masculinity has positive aspects that we should try to instill in young men. At the same time, I do think that there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, which goes too far and leads to negativity. There is a lot of chatter about this online, and I see a lot of extreme opinions. Some people openly hate men and then you've got people like Andrew Tate as well. What should I keep in mind while navigating all of this?
Well, thank you for the question, Jamshed. I'll start by saying that this issue of like young men, teenage boys, and, all the content they're consuming is something that I've kind of worried about for a while. I have some friends who are teachers, elementary school, middle school teachers, and they've told me stories. The friend I'm thinking of, she's a woman, and she's, told me that these young boys in her class will like sort of say these things that they heard online from TikTok, these like kind of like misogynist things that maybe they heard from Andrew Tate. They say them to her, and like they'll repeat like Andrew Tate quotes verbatim. And,
wow,
I guess
that's kind of incredible.
Yeah, it's, scary. And it's interesting. I actually went and I pulled some data on this because I was wondering, okay, is this just sort of like anecdotes from what I've heard, or is it accurate? Like, is there a larger trend here? There's this company called Savanta. They do like marketing research, and they polled 16 to 25-year-olds. They asked them, do you have a like positive view of Andrew Tate? 32% of people 32% of men said yes. For those that don't know, quickly, Andrew Tate is like this, I don't know how you describe him.
Just like annoying phenomenon.
Kind of like openly misogynist dude.
Yes,
he like
very
just
open.
Thinks very lowly
picks
of women.
Up of like what other people are feeling and just puts it on the most extreme measure.
That's a good way of putting it. I mean, you see that a lot online. People like kind of, ratcheting up the extremism of whatever people are saying. But Andrew Tate certainly does that. And he promotes this idea of like, men need to like subjugate women. Like we need to go back to like how things were, and that's what's wrong with the world, etc. Anyway, so the fact that I, found this study where it says 32% of young men have a positive view of him, like really alarmed me. For that same age range, 16 to 25 year old women, it was, 9%. That's also kind of strange.
That's also a little weird.
But the fact that it's 32% versus 9%, like I think it shows you the disparity there. And then also just zooming out, there's a company called Gallup, a very notable survey data company. And they did a survey a couple of years ago, and they showed that 25% of young men, which in their definition is 15 through 34, felt lonely like recently. And compared to women, it's 18%. Also not great. But the fact that there is that disparity, in general, I think points me towards this conclusion that young men are maybe in trouble in some cases.
Yeah, I want to point out and say that, toxic masculinity is not what most men want.
Of course, yeah.
I think media, social media, the news, and all these other individuals, even Andrew Tate, kind of put it as like, toxic masculinity is what society wants. Right. It's what we need in 2025. And that's just not the case. We are dealing with, as you mentioned before, a lack of role models. a lack of people to turn to. I mean, if you look at the 1990s and earlier, men knew who they wanted to be. They wanted to be like their fathers and their uncles and their coaches. And today, we don't really have, at least, I mean, my family, I come from a great family, and my parents were very loving, and my dad was very like emotional and vulnerable. But there's many individuals who aren't coming from those backgrounds. And so who do they turn to? They have to turn to online, and because that's what I mean, we did another stat, like the majority of young people are like spending like 9 hours or something looking at their phones on TikTok, Instagram. And we all know like these algorithms are really picking up on what people like to watch. And so that's all you're seeing. You're seeing Andrew Tate and his brother and all these individuals that are similar to him.
Right.
And on top of that, you had COVID, you had an epidemic of loneliness. People were indoors all the time. They weren't out and about working at the office. They were at home. And so the network of their friends sort of becomes very small. And if you're being conditioned by outside sources constantly, and you have no person to look up to as a mentor, these are kind of like the consequences of those actions.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I had a friend who made a brand new TikTok account, and she put, I am a 16-year-old male in like the sign up fields. And she just was curious what she'd get in her feed as soon as she created the account, brand new account. The first things she got was like Andrew Tate content.
Wow.
The fact that like it's being, it's just TikTok is serving that because that's what people in that age group and that demographic are engaging with. Right. But imagine if you are a young man, you download TikTok and that's the first thing there, and if you don't have a positive role model in your life, male role model, then you just get sort of like, shoved in that direction. It's not even your fault.
Right.
And I just, in general, there's this tendency of social media to push people into more and more extremes. The Wall Street Journal did a great study on that a while ago with TikTok, where they showed how like no matter what your interest is, it pushes you into further and further extremes. When we want to talk about young men and this, Andrew Tate and similar people, this manosphere, whatever you want to call it, I think that is somewhere that we should really be looking. And like you said, this lack of male role models, it's something that, this is something that we'll get into, like if you have young men in your life, how to be a positive role model. But I would certainly say that's one of the key things to talk about here.
Yeah, there's these extremes, like you mentioned it. Unfortunately, in our society, we also have like you can't be in the middle on any point, even politically, socially, mentally. You have to sort of be on one side of the aisle. And I say this as it's a general universal fault of all of us, that we all have to sort of build from. That men, when we think of masculinity, we immediately think of like harsh, dominant, we have to put the other person down. And then, just look at the way they were raised. Like, don't act like a girl. Don't throw like a girl. There's so many things. I remember growing up, it was like this extreme idea of like, don't be like the other person. But then we also have this other extreme, I feel like at least, where it's like, if you do act feminine just a little bit, you're seen as an anti-man. You're seen as someone who like, you're not a man. Something must be genetically wrong with you.
Yeah.
And I don't like that either. I mean, I find myself growing up, I was emotional. I was vulnerable. I wanted to reach out. I didn't want to feel isolated. I wasn't like the other men. I felt like, I had a feminist side inside of me, but I was always targeted as like, oh, you're other. You're like the other person. But then when I started focusing myself to, okay, maybe I am more of a feminist. Maybe that's where the side I'm going to be. Then I also got by the females were also the women were also like, wait, you need to be more dominant. You need to be more like them. So men, I find I don't know, what men today growing up do. At least for me, I had some sort of like a sway. I could be in some category, but today I don't think men understand where they are.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up that balance, because I think that as individuals, it's something we deal with, but then also like as a society, it's something that we deal with. And, the reason I mention it is because there's this analogy in the Baha'i faith of, men and women being two wings of a bird. And for those that don't know, me and Mateen, we come from a Baha'i background. And I just like to share this quote because I think it will help guide our conversation about masculinity. It says, "The world of humanity has two wings. One is women and the other men. Not until both wings are equally developed can the bird fly. Should one wing remain weak, flight is impossible. Not until the world of women becomes equal to the world of men in the acquisition of virtues and perfections can success and prosperity be attained as they ought to be." And that was written by Abdul Baha, who's the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith. You know, when this quote was written, it was the early 20th century, right? And at that point, you know, this sort of balance was clearly, you know, in favor of men, and women were, you know, on the sort of short end of the stick, so to speak. You know, that's unfortunately still largely the case in a lot of, you know, the world.
A lot of countries.
But it's interesting what's happened. There's this book by Richard Reeves called Of Boys and Men. Came out a few years ago, generated a lot of like conversation around this topic. And one of the things he talks about is, you know, there was this good-natured initiative in Western countries, the US, Western Europe, whatever, to uplift women, to uplift young girls, because, you know, for so long, you know, they had been second to men. And as women entered the workforce, et cetera, there was this momentum behind, okay, we need to uplift young girls, which is amazing. But like when keeping this balance in mind, you know, it's great if like both wings are becoming stronger, but if instead you focus on one wing and the other wing, this is kind of the point that he makes in the book. You know, I'm not sure if I like 100% agree with it, but the point that he makes is that, you know, if you focus on, you know, put so much emphasis on uplifting women, then maybe the men feel a bit neglected, and then maybe the men feel a bit resentful, and they feel like, well, what about me? And then you see, you know, all these, you know, effects that come out of that. The thing I think about is when you go to the gym, right? Ask like a, you know, personal trainer or physical therapist, like if you have one side of your body, one muscle, like my right arm is stronger than my left arm.
Awkward looking.
Well, not only is it awkward, it actually can be a problem. Like it actually, you can get injured, you know, like there are like big problems that come from that. And there are certain things that they'll do to correct it. But the fact that it can like actually, not only does it look weird, but it actually causes an issue. Like even internally, we need this balance within ourselves, right? Within, you know, our body, the strength of each side of us. And I think the same thing is true societally. We need this, this balance.
Yeah. I mean, again, when we say these quotes, not to misconstrued in any way, you know, we don't mean sameness.
Right.
That's the beauty of diversity. There are many flowers in one garden. You know, there doesn't need to have all the same roses. There's so many beautiful flowers that can be shared and viewed upon wherever you are, whoever you are. You know, when we, just like how, like the analogy of our body, we can think of like our ear and our feet. Our ear we need to hear, but it's just as important as our foot because we need to be able to walk. And so it's like we need both. And so that's the understanding of these sort of a pair of wings of a bird. And so, you know, we need women to be put on the top because they need to grow, they need to soar, they need to do more than they are being provided today. But also men need to get to a level of like, clearly there's this idea of the shame. They should not be shamed into believing that they are noble, and same with the women. And I think that both these wings need to fly as you mentioned. But it seems like today, to sort of change into a different subject, is that men are, it's idea of condition. I think conditioning is really important to talk about, that we don't discuss enough, is because a lot of times this understanding is, you know, I've heard this around, is like men are evil, or like even women are evil.
Yeah.
We put ourselves in these categories and generalize everybody because of what we have seen on social media. But this is a clear understanding of conditioning and not intent. It's not something you were born with.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, one thing I see online and among friends is this, you know, a lot of people, when they say like men are evil or what, like, I think a lot of it, like, or some of it is in jest, you know, like they're joking to a degree. Right. But, you know, imagine if you are a young man on TikTok and you see all this content. Sure, maybe a lot of it is done as just like sort of poking fun. You know, it's not meant to be serious. The person posting it doesn't actually hate men. They're just exaggerating to whatever. But if you're a young man and you're seeing all that, you might not be able to tell the difference. And it's a very, powerful thing when you feel like society is kind of against you in some ways. Like if you're seeing all this negative content and then the other content you're seeing on TikTok are these Andrew Tate type characters who are saying, no, actually you're amazing. And the problem is the other side of the equation. And the other, like we need to flip the whole power dynamic, whatever. Then like I can understand how if you didn't have role models, if you didn't know any better, you would start to sort of get attracted to that way of thinking.
I wanted to add something.
Yeah,
A lot of times, and I want to make sure that you guys are understanding, is like, as Jason mentioned, this is like 32% of men of this particular age group that believe have favorable views of Andrew Tate. Yeah. But like Andrew Tate is like also the extreme, and there's different perspectives of a masculine toxic man. I mean, like Andrew Tate's stuff is like vile and disgusting, and that on its own is weird. But then there's another take of it where it's like it has nothing to do with Andrew Tate. It's just like the way they've been raised because of their parents. Yeah. The way, they were raised in a single family home, just with their father, just with their grandfather, single parent home. Single parent home, single family. There's no family, single parent home. And so, that can affect them. Like when you're given messages of like, don't cry, don't be weak, don't ask for help, right? Be useful. Like, so, what are you doing? Like just standing there, like, this idea sort of gets infiltrated at age 4 or 5 years old. I mean, the people we're talking about Andrew Tate as if like these are 13, 14-year-olds. I'm talking about even younger, 5, 6-year-olds who they've been mesmerized by something that their dad does or their grandfather did. And then how they treated their mom or their sisters. Yeah. That's going to play a role. And what we're animalistic in behavior. We're monkey see, monkey do. We do a lot of copying as humans. You see someone doing something over time that gets built on, you're going to do it yourself. You're going to do it again.
On that topic of kind of reclaiming masculinity, redefining it, when I was doing research and pulling from different religious sources, I found this quote from the Bible. It's in Corinthians 16, it's 13 and 14. It says, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, let all that you do be done in love. That's from the English Standard Version translation. I find it inspiring that even in this text that is 2,000 years old, it talks about like how to act as men. And it says all that you do be done in love. I think that too often perhaps we think, like people think when you hear the phrase be a man, when someone tells you to be a man, what goes through your head? For me, it's like, okay, like I got to just do it. I got to like bust down this door. I got to like, whatever.
You got to take care of the family. Everything's on you.
Yeah. But like sometimes I think of it in sort of like people are implying a forceful way. We're like, be a man, get it done, but like the idea of instead like being a man through compassion and through love. Right. There's also, interestingly enough, something from Proverbs. It's Proverbs 16:32. Better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. Kind of a similar thing where it's like instead of brute forcing your way through, as maybe like the traditional masculine whatever would tell you to do, the warrior, instead be patient, like be tactful. I like this idea of, reclaiming, because masculinity unfortunately has been appropriated by some people online, these extremist people. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, we shouldn't say, okay, well, masculinity is just evil in general. Sure, like in extremes, it's not good. We're not meant to take it to that crazy place. But kind of what you were saying earlier, the equality of men and women doesn't mean that they are one and the same. Their differences are to be celebrated and nurtured. In the overall societal picture, we need to have this balance between men and women. But we also need to sort of, celebrate, nurture, et cetera, develop the differences, the things that make women special and the things that make men special.
Yeah. Masculinity is, in my point, very important. Not the toxic stuff, but masculinity, we shouldn't forget that men are masculine. I mean, you can't, to make someone the way they aren't or they are, it's going to take way more time and it's going to have way more consequences. I think what we have here is that men are and put it more on men. Put it the conversation again. We understand that the men are they need to fix this internally, right? But again, a lot of these problems, and I'm going to talk about like suicide real quick, is that men die by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women in the U.S. That's making up 75 to 80% of suicide deaths. This is not a small thing to talk about. And so why it's possible, and many scientists and data has shown that, men have to internalize pain. They don't have places to go to. They don't have people to talk to. Maybe women do to most part. They have their own circles, but men just don't do that. And so what ends up happening is what does toxic masculinity, what does suicide rates, what does a man being doesn't feel like he's good enough, what does that do? And so we need to focus and address the issues that men are dealing with. We can't throw them under the rug. And why we need to do that is because by focusing on men and fixing the problem and trying to figure out where the middle ground is, compromising and finding that balance, we're now helping. This will affect women. This will affect relationships. This will affect families. This will affect future generations. I understand that, a child being raised in a family that has both a man and a woman, that child is being affected by both individuals, both perspectives. And I think a man who is being raised and being taught to have considerations of love, emotion, care, kindness, I think by focusing on these things, the next generation of young people, slowly and surely, things will get fixed. So there's a quote from Abdu'l-Baha, again, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, and he says this. He says, the true worth of men is to be measured by the nobility of their character, not by the worldly possessions or position they occupy. And it's this one hits me right at home because, as a man being, raised up, you're like, you need to be the moneymaker of the house. You need to go out there. You need to work your ass off. You need to come home, and there's gonna be like a cup of soup waiting for you at home. Like that is the way, the mentality of not, I'd say, a religious individual, but like the way that I've been raised.
Sure.
And so this quote from Abdu'l-Baha really sets at home is that I can be noble in other ways, that I can be defined as a man in other ways.
Right.
I can be defined by my character.
Yeah.
And not by the money that I make.
Right. I agree completely.
Really important.
Yeah. And there are plenty of couples now where the woman makes more than the man, or like traditionally there's been this provider role of the man, and we're seeing, that sort of change in some areas of society. But I love what you said. One thing that I think we get caught up in a lot, we talked about this a bit in a materialism episode, is just, sort of getting caught up in this material world. One perspective that I love from, the Baha'i faith, but it's also true of other religions, the idea that when you are in the womb, before you're born, you're developing these faculties for like where you're going next, right? You're developing ears, eyes, hands, etc. And, if you ask the baby, not the babies can talk, but if you ask the embryo baby, why are you growing these things? Are they of any use? They would have no idea. But sure enough, they need those to function in the next world. And if they don't have it, they're, handicapped in a way. And the reason I bring it up is because, it's said in the Baha'i faith that this is true in this world of like these virtues, these qualities, the character that you're building, where, I have no idea what happens, after we die, but my understanding is that we will need these things.
You don't know what happens?
Do you?
No,
did you get the trailer, the sneak peek?
I got some preview, my dreams. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Write in the comments if you know what happens after you die.
We'd love to have you on the show.
Yeah, we'd love to have you on the show. But my understanding is that like, you know, you don't take this material stuff with you when you die, right? Like the Egyptians would like bury themselves with all their gold and, you know, their chariots, and they would hope that they would get to take that. But I mean, I am doubtful, frankly, personally, that that's how it works. I think instead you know, the things that are fundamental to you, your kindness, your generosity, your, you know, love, you know, etc. That's what you take with you. So kind of to your point, you know, maybe it is this matter of focusing less on like providing. Maybe some people get obsessed with providing as the man, and then it like develops into this like unhelpful dynamic they have with themselves. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, you know, I didn't get that raise at work, and am I failing as a man? And then you can get into this negative spiral, etc. Not that that's happening with these young boys, but at the same time, some of these people online, these influencers, you know, that like advertise this, you know, more extreme version of masculinity. You look at these people, and the way that they get attention is they have like a Lamborghini, or they have like a crazy watch, or they have whatever. And I think subliminally, maybe these young men think that that is what it means to be a man, to have this, you know, these means, to have this power, this status, whatever. It's a very like old school way of thinking, but I think unfortunately appeals to some men.
Yeah.
Right? They get carried away with that.
Yeah. I wonder what is the solution to focusing on that? Like, because what you just mentioned and what I just mentioned, and based from Abdu'l-Baha, is pretty much the solution. You know, we're getting to a point where, what are you going to do? Are you going to just like, you know, call YouTube and say, hey, anything with Andrew Tate on it, you must remove, block him, you know, there's a point where like the material is out there now. People have access to it. There's millions and millions of things, and people can say whatever they want. So what are we going to do, you know, to provide to all these men that are listening to say, and women, to say like, hey, you know, there's a solution to it. And so one thing I find, and if I find because it doesn't work, is shaming. Shaming does not work. You know, it doesn't work to your, you know, best friend. It doesn't work if as a parent to a child, and it doesn't work society in general. Like, you know, on social media, I see it all the time. We're shaming people. Boom, boom. Don't do this. Don't do that. How dare you? Yeah. That's not the right accountability. We need accountability, but that's not how we do it. We need guidance. We can't do abandonment. A lot of times this idea comes to like, oh, that guy's bad. Like even like someone like Andrew Tate, like a crazy example is Andrew Tate. You know, like we kind of in our back of our minds, like he's too far gone. He's lost. No one can bring him back and to find that middle ground. That's not true. That's not true. Everybody can change. Everyone can be provided, unless they're just completely, you know, ignorant to the ideas, which many people unfortunately are. But there's a majority of people, of young people in society today that aren't part of these extremes that people put them out to be. And they're ready to listen. They're ready to actually be a part of the solution. And I just know that shaming is not the way to do it.
What I'm hearing you say is you want to have Andrew Tate on the show, and we're gonna make him change his ways.
We're locking the door. Oh, yeah. No, I do not want that guy in here.
Yeah, I mean, I am glad that you said, you know, you talked about shaming doesn't work, and you also talked about like calling YouTube and telling them to take everything down doesn't work. You know, that's an interesting point. This idea of censorship, right? You know, if I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a young parent who maybe has a young child, you know, who's a boy, and there's beginning to be concerns about, okay, are they going to see this content? Certainly, like, you know, parental controls, et cetera, can help, but ultimately it's out there. And like, if your, you know, kid goes to school and like one of their friends has a phone and they show them, like, unfortunately it's just out there and it's popular among that age group. So I think what's more important for young men, even, you know, young adults, et cetera, is giving them the tools, you know, and helping them sort of understand, like, yes, you can, you know, try to shame. Yes, you can try to hide something. But like, when I think about, you know, me as a kid, when my parents told me, don't do this, whatever,
it makes
I just want to do it more.
Exactly. You want to do it more. You're like, when is my chance to actually do it?
Right. But instead, I think if you know, have this conversation whether it's, whether you happen to be a parent or whether maybe it's a, young nephew you have, or just a friend or whatever, family friend, talking to them about these things. Like, it's a tough conversation to have, because, like you're not sure if they're seeing this content or not, but unfortunately from the stats, at least that we've seen, it is out there. Their friends are talking about it. If it's true that 32% of men in this age range have positive views, then that's like 1 in 3 friends. If your kid has 3 friends, one of them maybe feels that way. So one thing to think through is, having these conversations, starting with simple things, asking them if they've heard of, trying to be non-judgmental, because once again, you don't necessarily want to fully put you can never watch this person, because then they're going to get interested. But I think it starts with those simple conversations, and it also starts with setting, an example, being a role model, right? That can look like many different things. It's hard for us, obviously, to give advice. Everyone's situation out there is different. But I think, being understanding of what your, child, family, friend, nephew, whatever is saying when they're talking about, if it comes up and if they're like, oh yeah, my friend, showed me this video, and like, oh, well, what was the video? What did it say? Well, it said this. It's like, well, that's kind of maybe a negative way to think about women. What do you think? Like, how do you think of, like just trying to, slowly explore those things with them, and then being a role model, treating people obviously with compassion, respect, etc. But I mean, it's amazing how young people, but young men in particular, really need a role model. Like, I'm lucky to have some family friends. I have this one family friend. It's my old nanny. She lives in Sweden. I go to visit her sometimes and her family, and they have this young boy. He's, I think, 6 or 7, and he just latches onto me whenever I come. I mean, I look completely different than any Swedish person. At first, when I got there, he was scared because I had brown hair, and they're like, "Why isn't this guy's hair?" And why doesn't he speak Swedish? What's this weird language? But even though he doesn't speak, my language, we are just best friends when we're over there, and I hope that I'm being, even though he doesn't speak the language, I hope that I'm being a good role model. He has a sister. I try to be fair between them. I try to split my time, whatever. But it just is an example that even when there's a language barrier, even when people come from worlds apart, it's young men, I really think, need a role model. Yeah. The fact that Andrew Tate, not to gas this guy up. He's he's not the only one out there, it's just, he's a useful stand-in for the entire.
There's a link to his video after this.
No, there's not. All these characters, I think that's the reason why they've gotten success, is because they, have all these young men that need that role model. So fill that void. For whoever it is in your life.
I feel like men listen to other men. I'm in a children's class, and a children's class, basically, it's a spiritual program in the Baha'i faith where children of all ages and backgrounds and religions come together, and they just understand the basics of virtues and what it means to be a good person, right? And so we're having a children's class, and it's me and my co-teacher, who's a female, and a child who's 7, 8 years old will say, I'm the boss. A guy who's I'm the boss, and you guys are my assistants to the females that are sitting. Whoa. And the women in the room are like, yeah, I'm your assistant. Yeah, but I'm sitting there, I'm listening. I'm like, this is all fun and games right now. But as time goes on, these kids grow up. I don't know. I think they're gonna just take it internally. When the female teacher said to him, hey, don't do that, kind of just was whatever. Yeah. You don't know what you're talking about. My dad's the boss. Why can't I be the boss? Stuff like that. And then when I saw that didn't work, I chimed in and I said, hey, don't do that. You could just see an instant in this boy's mindset.
Interesting.
He said, okay, well, what would you be then? He asked me, would you be the boss? And I said, we can all be co-bosses. How about that? And he thought about it for a second. He's like, I don't really like that, but okay, fine, I'll do it. And no one thought about it. The other girls were like, okay, I'll be a co-boss too. But just that switch in ideology I believe can make a difference. So I do believe that if a man sees something and he says, for example, he sees sexual harassment, he sees something that should not be done, and he tells his friend, hey, don't do that. I think that as a guy, you take it more internally. You're like, okay, you know what, I don't know what it is about us, we're just like, oh, we're gonna, something switches, like, okay, I'm gonna listen to that.
Yeah.
So it's very important, I would say, as if you have friends, if you see anyone and you're part of that same background demographic, I would say, like, hey, say something.
For sure.
Act.
Yeah.
Don't shame them. That's very important, but definitely make an action.
Yeah. And I think it's particularly relevant with this issue, because if you find yourself in a position where you are consuming this content and you have, maybe these internalized things like, oh, like women need to be below men, whatever craziness. If a woman, like, said, like, I'm just thinking, put yourself in the position of this person, like they, if a woman says, hey, don't do that, that just fits into their worldview,
Right.
and their worldview is like, oh, you don't know any better.
Right.
But, if a man, unfortunately, they're in the situation where they, respect men's opinion more than women. So it does, like you say, take a man to sort of get them to kind of snap out of it. So, for the men that are listening, like, it's something to be aware of. And let's be honest, it's not just among young men. It's not just among teenagers, whatever.
No.
It happens everywhere. Like, people say things that, like, people talk about, like, locker room talk or whatever.
Right.
But, like, long story short, sometimes people say stuff that's uncalled for. And, there's a decision you have to make as an individual in that moment. You can either call it out, or you can just sort of silently let it go. And the implicit message, if you silently let it go, is like, okay, that kind of thing is acceptable in this space. Like, right. I will tolerate if you, say whatever. And I think it's important to call it out. And then, for the women out there, maybe advocate to the men in your life, say like, hey, like, does this kind of thing ever come up? Like, maybe you should say something, whatever. Everyone's situation is different, but I like your point. It's an important thing that, we sort of keep each other accountable. Because yes, these online social influencers have a large influence, but more influential than someone on your phone is like someone, in your community, in your friend group, in your, children's class, whatever, that is actually face-to-face telling you like, whoa, like, we don't do that here.
Right. Like a hard stop or like a pivot in many ways, like sort of moving away from that conversation, or going back to it and saying, hey, what you did was not nice or fair or respectable. Like, all these things are very important things that need to be mentioned at the time and not at a later date.
Right.
I think what it's really important here is that all, or at least most men, want the same thing. They want to be respected. They want to feel useful. They want to feel emotionally safe. They want to be strong without being cruel, and they want to matter to people's lives. And if we can do all that without, getting into toxic categories, then there's this, men won't have to, at least I can see, men won't be dominant, or at least this idea of like dominance and cruelty. They won't be controlling, because I think control actually plays a lot of roles with men as well. They always want to control the situation. And instead of all that, they'll be feeling belonging and purpose. Because at the end of the day, we all want this, men and women, we all want purpose in our lives. And if this purpose can have good meaning to it, actionable meaning. Like, for example, instead of your group of friends, young men, going out and catcalling people and going out to the bars and doing things that just doesn't feel right, because that the society today, that people do that a lot. Go to the gym instead. Take your energy and put it out on the weights. Go to the beach, go on a walk, do something healthy. And if the conversation of masculinity and dominance comes up, try to be the bigger person and discuss it, talk about it without shaming and or preaching to them that you know more. Because again, the moment individuals feel, we all know that, I feel it, we feel like we're being preached to, or we're feeling like that person knows more, everything they say gets turned off.
Right. Yeah. One last thing I want to say as we're beginning to wrap up here is, when we're on the topic of this toxic masculinity, or whatever you want to call it, you see a young person that's beginning to have these ideas in their head. Maybe they're watching the Andrew Tates, the TikToks, whatever. It's very important to call it out early, right? Think about like a snowball at the very top of a very big hill. Like as it rolls down the hill, it gains more and more momentum. If you just nudge that snowball a tiny amount at the top of a hill, there's a huge difference between where it ends up.
Right.
And it's important to remember that, especially among young men, when we're talking about instilling, these ideals of masculinity. What does true masculinity look like? It's important that we address it early. We don't shy away from it. Once again, this is, of course, your own children, but then other young men in your life, cousins, whatever, people in your community.
Right.
It's important to focus on this, because if you wait until they're older and these, more negative aspects of masculinity have already manifested themselves, in some way it may be not too late, but there's a lot more momentum behind it. So it's just an important thing, I think, to kind of notice it early and then act on it, call it out.
Yeah, so there's 3 things I would say that a young person can do really to master avoiding toxic masculinity. One is not to suppress their emotions, to really feel their emotions. Don't deny them. Pause before acting. Think about what you're going to say before saying it, or what you're going to do. And then number 2 is I wouldn't tie, as that quote from Abdu'l-Baha and many others that Jason read, I wouldn't tie your worth to attention, to status or approval. Focus on yourself. Don't focus on the material things and what the attention that brings, because usually that stuff doesn't bring any good attention. Build confidence through discipline and integrity, not through these other things that Andrew Tate sort of wants to believe that are worth focusing on. And then with friends, and this is something that Jason and I do, is that we normalize honest conversations. We have a group called Men's Group, where men's get together.
Very original name.
It's a very original. And men get together and we have different topics we talk about. Women have their women's group, and men don't particularly have groups where they can feel vulnerable and safe and a judgment-free zone. And it's very private. We get together at someone's home and we just talk about things, and we play some games and we have some food and we hang out and we talk about fear. We talk about failure. We talk about rejection. We talk about purpose. And I think if more individuals had spaces like this, we wouldn't be dealing with all these extremist points of view.
Yeah. I agree. Well, hopefully that was helpful. Thank you guys so much for listening. Today we talked about this craziness that we're seeing online as far as these extreme viewpoints of masculinity. We talked about different religions and their perspective on it, the Bible and Corinthians and Proverbs, and then the Baha'i faith, this aspect of 2 wings of a bird. And then, we just ended with this idea of balance, right? How do we set an example? How do we hold that balance within ourselves, within society in general? We hope you guys enjoyed listening. Just as a reminder, we are like a super young podcast. And if you enjoyed listening today, the best thing that you can do is share it with a friend. This episode, perhaps another episode, that would really help us out, given that we're just so young. We're just starting out. Of course, all the normal things as well, like, subscribe, follow us on Spotify, rate us, do all that stuff. But above all else, if you think there's someone that would, respond well to this episode or another episode, please share it. That's the biggest thing that you can do to help us.
Yeah, share and please comment. We'd love to hear your perspectives, your point of view. If you have any advice that you'd like to give, things that have worked, things that haven't worked, we'd love to hear it. So
yeah, topic suggestions as well. This was written in by someone, and every single week we do a topic that's listener submitted. So there's a link in the description if you'd like to do that as well. But thanks so much for watching, guys. We appreciate it.
Thanks for joining.